Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with the morning breakout session here. Hopefully everybody's in the right room. This session is Foundations. This is a very creative title, Foundations in the Economic Recession. We figured we didn't need to spend much time coming up with a creative title because it really gets to the heart of the matter. As we were thinking about, we have a great participation this year in our conference from the foundation community, and we're grateful for that, of course. And when we talked about possibly doing a couple panel sessions at the conference, rather than the traditional funders panel that you might see at conferences, where most of the time is just spent on the foundations and priorities, and we're going to take some time to do that piece too, but we also wanted to look at how we could engage the foundation community in a discussion, learn some insights from them about key issues facing the nonprofit community. And of course, one, we know it's been a tremendously difficult year for a lot of organizations. The economic downturn has had impacts on all of our work. And we know as well the foundation community as well. And so we thought this was a great opportunity, at least during this panel session, to talk about that, learn some insights from the foundation community about what they're seeing both across the country as well as within their own foundations, how they're responding to and dealing with the economic downturn. You'll notice here, I'll introduce our panels in a second, but we took some time to try to put together a panel of diverse funders. So you have some smaller foundations, you have corporate foundations, you have regional foundations here on the panel. We thought that was pretty important to try to get as many perspectives as possible as we could. I also want to note that the session format, we'll go through some introductions and we'll hear from the foundation folks about their own foundation and what they fund and their priorities. And then we'll have some questions to start the dialogue around the issue of the economic recession and the impact on nonprofits. But we also hope that plenty of time is there for conversation with all of you. It's intentionally designed to be relatively informal, actually. So this is a great opportunity to get some questions answered. I'm kind of reminded of the notion, I don't know who coined this term, but I've heard it said within the foundation community and others, if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. And what we mean by that is they're just like nonprofit organizations. They're all very, very different. They all respond to challenges and opportunities differently, and I think you're going to see that today as well amongst the panel when we're talking about this issue. So let me first introduce our panelists. I'm starting from the far, which would be my left, your right. First, we have Bonnie Sachitella-Sawyer. She's a board member with the Charlotte Martin Foundation, which headquartered in Seattle, Washington, Bonnie. You've also seen Bonnie. She is the executive director here at Hopa Mountain, nonprofit organization in Montana. So, Bonnie, welcome. To Bonnie's right, we have Kelly Brueggemann, who's the executive director of the First Interstate Bank System Foundation based out of Billings, Montana. And then we have, to Kelly's right, Dave Coleman, program director for the M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust based out of Vancouver, Washington, a regional funder. And then to Dave's right, let me get my numbers right here. We have Kevin Walker, President and CEO of Northwest Area Foundation, based out of, I've got Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's actually St. Paul, isn't it? St. Paul, we don't want to, it's the twin cities. St. Paul probably looks at Minnesota. Yeah, right, we got that. So Kevin Walker, President and CEO of Northwest Area Foundation. Kevin, welcome. And then finally, Mike Halligan, who's the executive director of the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, based right here out of Missoula, Montana. So with that, maybe we should just start with some panel's introductions. We've asked them to take about three minutes, give or take, and introduce themselves, briefly describe their foundation, their location, priorities, range of grant size, this standard introduction to our panelists and their foundation. So let's start with Bonnie. And you might have to
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Bonnie Sechitello-Sawyer. I'm a board member with the Charlotte Martin Foundation. And Charlotte Martin was a native Montanan. She was born in Anaconda and spent a good number of her years growing up between Anaconda and Butte. 20 years ago, shortly before her death, she founded the foundation that I serve as one of 5 board members on today. It was her wish to fund youth education, culture, athletics, and wildlife and habitat preservation. And so we are a board of 5. There's no paid staff. We take applications on a rolling basis, and all the applications are taken online, and review them on a rolling basis throughout the course of a year. This is a relatively small foundation. We collectively give away about $1 million, $1.5 million every year. We fund in 5 states, Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. And in the last year, for those of you that have been following us on the web, you've seen that in 2009, we gave away our money early and then closed our site to applications. We expect to reopen that in the spring of 2010, and we haven't set a date yet, but we welcome the chance to talk with you and learn more about your projects. And our application typical award size is about $5,000 to $25,000 per grant. Thank you.
Kelly?
Great. Good morning, everyone. First Interstate Foundation is all about leveraging, and our biggest leveraging occurs with our branches and our employees. So like many corporate foundations, we have employee gift matching, volunteer matching programs, and then our branches have their own donation budgets, and if they're contributing to a project in their neighborhood, in their community, they ask the foundation to match, and we do a leveraging. So it's almost like there's 73 program officers for First Interstate out in the field where all of our branches are. It's very important for us that it happens on a community basis where the grants and the dollars occur. We, between the branches and the foundation, we contribute, in some years it's been as much as $2.5 million. We are a pass-through foundation, so what that means is we're a line item budget on the corporation. So dollars flow into the foundation each year, and then we grant it out.
Thanks, Kelly. Dave?
Dave Coleman with the M.J. Murdoch Charitable Trust. We are an endowed foundation that really began with the life and death of Jack Murdoch, who was a co-founder of the Tektronix company. He passed away in an untimely accident, and with his estate, the trust began in the 1970s. We are a regional foundation funding in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. Our roots in Montana are really there because Mr. Murdoch sold airplanes in Montana, is throughout the region as a little side business. One of our original 3 trustees, Jim Castles, is a Montanan. So we have a long time tie to the state of Montana. We're based in Vancouver, Washington. We fund in 4 program areas: scientific research, education, health and human services, and the arts. We also do different kinds of grants. We do capital projects, equipment, program expansion, and capacity building. We do not have a small grants program, so the smallest grant we would look at, or the request, would be $50,000. And the average size grant runs about $140,000, I think. Our process is that you go to our website and then submit a letter of inquiry if you think we might be interested in your project, and then you may be invited to complete an application. And then every quarter, our trustees look at a good batch of requests and then make their decisions. We will do probably this year about $26 or $27 million, down from what we were doing, but back to where we were about 4 to 5 years ago. We'll talk more about that later.
Thanks, Dave. Kevin?
That's not on. Is that better? Yeah, there we go. Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm Kevin Walker. I'm the president of the Northwest Area Foundation. As Brian said on his second try, we're based in St. Paul, Minnesota. I've only been there a little over a year and grew up in New York and then spent 20 years in Michigan. So I refuse to be locked into a St. Paul versus Minneapolis mindset. I'm by Metro completely. So you can say we're from Minneapolis if you want to. The Northwest Area Foundation is 75 years old this year, and its bloodlines, so to speak, run back to the railroad baron James J. Hill, who built the Great Northern Railway, running from the Twin Cities out to Seattle and touching many communities in between. His son started the foundation in 1934 with an initial donation of around $10 million. And to begin the conversation about impacts of the recession, or in our case of the stock market downturn, when our board posted my job, we had achieved a high watermark of $500 million in assets. At the depths of the market back in March, we were down around $320 million. So it still sounds like a huge amount of money, but if you replace the word million with muffins, say, and you ask yourself, well, how big a loss is that? It's huge. We've come up somewhat as the market has, but it's been a fascinating time to be new, let me just say. So our mission is to work with the communities and organizations and individuals of the 8 states that railroad used to touch to reduce poverty and help build sustainable prosperity. So a rather grand ambition. The 8 states are Minnesota and Iowa, North and South Dakota, Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. We are very much an organization in transition because that mission is a slight reframing of the mission that has guided the foundation since the late 90s. But how we're going to go about that is we are really in the process of reinventing. The previous generation of our work involved an attempt to partner directly with communities, which was not just rhetoric. There was an actual attempt to partner directly with communities. And we did that in 2 sort of ways. One was going deep and long in specific places that the foundation designated as a community. In some cases, that was very clear and coherent. It really was a community, such as the Lummi Indian Reservation north of Seattle. In some cases, it was pretty tenuous whether it was really a community or not. And our attempt to do that in Montana had that characteristic. It's a huge swath of the state that was classified as a community. Then on a smaller scale, but with greater spread across our region, the foundation is probably best known in Montana for a program called Horizons, which works in rural communities of 5,000 people or less. And the purpose of Horizons is to develop local leadership to make progress on issues of poverty and prosperity, basically. We are not backing away from those programs I just described. We are sort of rethinking them and reframing them to some degree. But the way in which we're in transition is we have decided that this ideal of a foundation partnering directly with communities across an 8-state region isn't the way we want to do things going forward, because it had the effect of sort of bypassing the institutional strength that existed already in communities in our states. So why am I at the MNA conference? To introduce myself to you all and to learn about what established nonprofits in Montana are doing, particularly on issues of reducing poverty or helping low-income people build prosperity for the future. We had the bad habit, I think, of coming up with our own theories in the past and bypassing a lot of knowledge and experience that already existed on the ground. So that's the fundamental sort of pivot that we're in the midst of doing. At the moment, we are accepting grant requests only by invitation. That is not because that's how we think we can best do business. It's because we are in a cash crunch right now that is more dramatic than what most foundations are encountering. Most foundations have had a dip, like the dip in assets I described. But we also have the situation that I inherited existing commitments, some of which run as far out as 2016, that are reflective of our old strategy rather than the newer one that we're developing. That puts us in a pretty tight box in terms of new flexible money to deploy. So rather than say to people across 8 states, yes, we're open for business, send us proposals, and then have to say no to, 299 out of 300 of those, we thought, no, we've got to be a little more modest and go a little slower. So I would invite you to go to our website or to catch me at some point, and I'll take you deeper into what specific things we are hoping to fund in the near term. But I think that's all I should say for now.
Thanks, Kevin. Mike?
Thank you, Brian. And I guess it's a credit to this organization when you look around at not only who all attended the main speaker that spoke just before these panels, and to see that the packed room and the important role that nonprofits play in society today. And I know part of my job is also governmental affairs with the companies, and as I looked at the legislative occupational breakdown this last session, I think there were at least 10 people who were serving as legislators that were either on the board, they were executive directors or higher level management members of nonprofit organizations serving in the legislature. And so and that never existed 10 years ago as I was tracking that information. So you're playing a much more significant role, and your voice, I think, is a lot greater now because of the nonprofit leaders that are in the legislative hallways. The Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, I've been there 6 years. I'm executive director. It was funded in 1988. By Dennis Washington, and then became the Dennis and Phyllis Washington after it was initially just the Dennis Washington Foundation. And it was funded, Dennis wanted to create a culture of philanthropy within the companies, and so there's a uniform assessment of the profits of every one of the companies in Montana that goes into the foundation every year, and so it's a quarterly assessment, and so it builds that in from the top down, that it will be part of every president's of every one of his companies' discussion when they begin every year. We are a foundation that doesn't have a grant cycle. It's all online. And so one of the easiest parts of my job is to be able to work relatively quickly with nonprofits to get them funds if they need it. And our online process is very simple to follow, with a minor screening process that gets you into a preliminary application that I link you to. And that process then allows you about 300 words to write a project description, and about 300 words to tell us how you're going to use our funds. It's kind of a letter of inquiry that other foundations use. We just use it electronically. We fund in general areas of arts and culture, education, health and human services, and community service. But in those categories, you've got to make sure you read the foundation eligibility criteria, because the preferences that Dennis Washington and Phyllis Washington have are mainly for education, and mainly for low-income, at-risk youth and those with special needs. And so there's preferences there. We have a donor that has that intent, and we have to follow it. And so sometimes what you do will not be a good fit for us, and you just hopefully will recognize that as you look at the criteria. But one of the things that we do is we try to make sure that we do site visits, but not that often. We know that the smaller nonprofits need to have more flexibility. You don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the staff to be able to do a lot of evaluation. You've got your nonprofits to run, and so we're a little more informal about our grant making process. We will send you at the end of a grant. Our average grant last year was $9,800. So we may have larger grants like the Phyllis J. Washington Education Center at the University of Montana campus, which is capital. It's $14 million. That's because Dennis and Phyllis wanted to do that. Don't look for us to do capital in hardly any other cases. It's a very rare thing for us to do. But we did the refrigerated trucks with the food banks recently, because when it came in the door, it's something we absolutely had to do. It was one of those things where I went to the board and said, this isn't something that we should ignore. Let's get it done. And so there are forays into capital that were mostly programmatic. And before you apply, you're going to want to make sure that you've got some local some support. And I think every one of the foundation websites indicate that there should be substantial support locally so that we can see that there's other skin in the game. And we want to know that you've got support out there. And so we're rarely the first ones in, which I know hurts in a lot of cases when you're trying to do new programs. But in our case, we want to make sure that you've at least got some ability to be able to sustain yourselves after the initial grant is awarded. And maybe I will stop there.
Thanks, Mike. But before we go any further, any questions for our panelists about their foundation, their priorities, anything like that? Okay. The one thing that I'll say is that I've got a series of questions here that we'll throw out and we'll begin kind of talking. But at any point in time, if there's questions or comments, please feel free to bring those forward. We don't necessarily want this to be questions with the panelists and the moderator, and then questions from the audience. So feel free to step forward and ask questions, bring them to the table, and I'll just continue to kind of move this along as we go. I know that many of the foundations have been getting together recently. Philanthropy Northwest just had their gathering. Let's see, Kelly and Mike, that was a couple of weeks ago, right? Out in Washington. And of course, our foundation panelists meet with their peers at quite a bit. At the risk of stating the obvious, I wonder if someone wants to kind of offer their kind of insights into assessing the institutional funding climate across the country and the region. Where has it been? Where is it now? Are there any insights that can be offered, generally speaking, before we dig a little bit deeper? Oh, sure.
And being a corporate foundation, I'll kind of talk a little more on the trends that corporate funders are seeing and what's been going on. There's been several surveys done among this particular type of foundation. And, it's we're all cautiously optimistic in that we anticipate our giving to be flat in 2010, some maybe even down, because a lot of the corporate giving comes from, in a lot of models there isn't an asset fund, it's your line item budget and that. And there's many strategies. Some people that have multi-year commitments thinking that this is 2009 is going to be, they have more funds available than they will in 10, are prepaying some of those in anticipation of that. The strategies are as unique as the foundations are. We had gone through a strategic planning at First Interstate prior to all of this, and we're looking at ways of leveraging our best resource, which is our human capital, the employees of First Interstate. And so that's another strategy that is really on the top burner for a lot of corporates, is how do we engage that asset in the communities, serving on boards, helping with the leadership of the nonprofits in that sense, serving as that volunteer force that helps the nonprofits with a low count of staff complete the fundraising projects that they have on.
Could I jump through, Kevin?
Building on some of what Kelly said, I think that the responses from foundations, and I should speak mostly from the private foundation perspective, are going to be very various. Brian used this old joke about you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. I'm seeing that play out as people grapple with this. For Northwest Area Foundation, we will, in our next fiscal year, pretty much maintain the same level of grant making that we'll be doing in the current fiscal year, which is good. We won't be going down, but you'll see some funders who are in fact simply going to be able to do less next year. And that's a pretty strong strand that I hear when I'm at gatherings of funders. A lot of people make the remark, well, it's really going to hit our budget next year. It just depends how they're arriving at their next year's budget, though. That's not set in stone how you do that if you're an endowed private foundation. Do you predict where the market is likely to end at the end of that year you're heading into, or do you have some more complex formula that you use to determine your budget? There are a lot of different ways funders can go. There are some funders who are paying out more, either more in terms of actual dollars flowing out or a significantly higher percentage of their asset base. And when funders do that, you'll always see some sort of value statement being made about, we've made a calculation that now is not the time to pull back. Now is the time to step forward and take a little pain ourselves in terms of taking a bit of a whack off of our asset base to help the communities that we exist to serve. An example of this that is not particularly relevant to Montana, but they're friends of mine, there's a foundation in Detroit called the Skillman Foundation that partners deeply with specific neighborhoods in Detroit. And I just heard their president say the other day that that's what they're doing. They've made a pledge to pay out a higher percentage of their assets for the next couple of years and sort of ramp it slowly down. So you'll see funders doing that. One of the interesting dynamics is that some funders are sort of required to exist in perpetuity. Our foundation is like that. So in the trust instrument that Louis W. Hill executed 75 years ago, it says right there in black and white, the corporation will exist in perpetuity. And I don't think he meant exist as an empty shell. I think he meant be a viable foundation. So those are my marching orders in terms of the long term. Not everybody has that. And so you do have living donors or endowed foundations that don't have that limitation deciding to be really aggressive in this environment. And if you can find funders who are a fit for you, who are taking that approach, it's wonderful, but they will be few and far between, I think. A couple of other observations. One of the things I've noticed is a lot of funders focusing on their existing grantees. So the approach is, well, there are organizations out there counting on us. Let's stick with them, see how we can help them as best we can, because that's the right thing to do. Again, that's just a value statement, but it cuts out people who aren't yet in the circle, and that's a painful thing for good organizations who haven't managed to crack a particular funder. And the tail of that impulse is going to be difficult, because it's going to lead potentially to an unwillingness by funders to fund innovation, to take a chance on an emerging organization. I think you'll hear increasingly from funders the language about, we want nonprofits to be collaborating more, even considering merging, et cetera. And all of that is true and necessary, I think. But there is that part of the nonprofit sector where new things happen and where new leaders come up with new ideas that deserve some resources. And I think we as funders are going to need to be careful not to get so boxed into a defensive posture that people in your shoes who are actually breaking new ground simply can't find any funding for it. I think we've got to be careful of that.
Last year we gave away about $1.4 million in the state of Montana, and this year we're going to give about $1.6. So we increased by a couple $100,000 how much we're going to give in the state of Montana. And I mean, Dennis and Phyllis are absolutely committed to make sure that we've got about $350,000 that goes out to basic need organizations that will go out the door almost automatically. We have another probably $400,000 in scholarships. Scholarships is a huge deal to Dennis and Phyllis, and so we have about 530 kids going to school at any given time. They're financial needs-based scholarships, and so those are two huge components that will always be there. But our endowment is so conservatively invested that we didn't hardly lose anything in the downturn, and so it's rare for anyone to be able to say that, but we were very lucky, and that's just the way we operate anyway, or the way Dennis operates. And so we're able to withstand that and increase our investment in nonprofits. And so, but I think we are looking at, as we look forward, the collaboration issue in a meaningful way. And so when Rosie Buzzes calls from Flagship and says she needs help, I want to make sure, and she has, looked at every avenue that she can, every person that she can partner with, every organization that might be available to be able to collaborate with her. Because if we can fund several organizations to help with those after-school programs, we want to do that. But it has to be meaningful and tangible, and then we want it to be measurable. And so the new focus, with endowments declining and just the industry looking a little closer at what what we're funding is, are we having the impact that we want to have? And the board asks that all the time. How do we know we've had an impact on a child or a person? How do we measure that? And in many cases, it's very difficult. And it takes 20 years or 10 years to do that. And so there's not an easy answer to that question, but evidence-based giving, I think, is much more elevated in all of the board's minds now.
Well, I think it's really clear if you're an endowed foundation, except for your assets. Most of us are really down. But the real key issue is what kind of commitments that a foundation has made for the future. We don't fund operations, so we don't have any ongoing list of organizations that we're expected to fund each year, and we also don't do a lot of multi-year grants. We do some, but most of our grants are paid out in about 18 months. So for us, the real question is how many requests are coming through the door, and our giving will go back to where it was about 4 to 5 years ago, which was really good. It spiked at 42 million last year, which was kind of an aberration, but we're back. But our trustees are looking at about 75 proposals every quarter, where they were looking at about 50. And you said something, Kevin, about foundations emphasizing the organizations that they've already funded. And we're one of those that are doing that. We've said we have to constrict the proposals, the number of proposals that are coming through the door. And so we're less likely to look at a brand new organization to us right now. So if you're brand new, we're just much less likely to consider it at the letter of inquiry stage. So if you're in, you're in. But that we hope will change. We'll just see where that goes. Our trustees, it's not business as usual. So in every foundation, everyone is just taking this a day at a time. And so
maybe I could stop and ask if we could get some comments from the audience. Probably everybody in here, you wouldn't be in this room if you're not doing at least some foundation fundraising. What are your experiences? What are you hearing? What's been your successes, your challenges securing funds in this climate? I've got a couple of hands. We'll start just in the front. Jono?
Thanks, Brian. I guess mine is more of a question. For our organization is just completed kind of a strategy which is resulting in some changes in our business plan. And I'd be interested, because we are going to be increasing our outreach to foundations and other sources of private support. And given the fact that Kevin and you spoke about you're not necessarily entertaining new proposals, what advice would you have for nonprofit leaders to begin cultivating those relationships with prospective funders that may not be able to award grants now, and yet potentially are great partners for you in the future?
Well, I'll jump in first, I guess. Another cliche of the trade, like the great one that Brian mentioned before, is when you want to ask, how does this go? When you want money from a foundation, ask them for advice. And when you want advice, ask them for money. There's some truth to
Write that down. Write that down.
The problem with that is once the foundation person has heard that joke, it actually sticks with you. So whenever somebody comes up and says to me, I just want to get your advice, I want to pick your brain, I think, oh, you've heard it too, yeah.
It's not a joke, Kevin. That's reality. It works on private donors too.
Well, in every joke, there's a big grain of truth, so maybe it's both. Yeah, I don't mean to suggest it doesn't work. There is some truth in it. So my response to your question would be, make sure the donor you're trying to build a relationship with has the potential to fund what you're doing. I've been on both sides of this. I've been a grant seeker as well as a grant maker, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of doing that legwork and homework up front to figure out, are they ever going to fund us? Not, can I, a very persuasive and fantastic executive director, persuade them to fund our issue? Because that's a losing battle. The question is, well, if they had more money, would we be in the mix at all? If the answer is yes, then I would say pretty aggressively build the relationship. Don't ask them for money. Just try to get on their mental radar screen as somebody they ought to know. I know that my sense of these things is that there are lots of people I ought to know and I ought to understand what their work is. Even if it's pretty clear to me we're not going to be able to fund them next year or even the year after, one of the reasons I don't just sit in St. Paul, Minnesota, but try to get around our 8 states is just to meet people and understand who's doing what. You never know when that is going to lead to a funding opportunity. That kind of relationship building takes time, but it can be fun because you often learn as much as you share when you do that. But I recognize that if you're struggling to survive, if you're worried about making payroll in 2 weeks, it's hard to set aside the time to build relationships for the long run. But to me, that's the only way to go.
Mike Checkman, here. Oh, we got someone. Okay. Dave, did you want to comment on that? Or?
No, I would just say things will change, so watch the websites. And I think the websites will keep you up to date as to organizational priorities.
We'll go Mike, and then we'll come up here.
That's okay. Mike Scheckman with Big Sky Institute for the Management of Nonprofits. Answering part of your question, one of the problematic things we're seeing is changes in leadership in national foundations that have had a historic commitment to rural, and that's disappearing. And in particular, Kellogg and Ford. We're also seeing some shifts like with Carnegie and where they put money into some rural states, their program emphasis now preclude that, get in the way. And I say that as a contextual point to pose the question to regional foundations, in particular not pointing at anyone on the panel, but just generically, and that is, I think there may be opportunities for very interesting partnerships that have the regional foundations engaging the national foundations in ways that have not been invited before, but in terms of resources to help them leverage impacts they're interested in. That may be a different kind of conversation that I think Montana foundations are fabulous and they're giving in so many ways, but they're not big. And I think that scale issue is really important to leverage some of those national foundation dollars that are not going to low population states now. Comment?
I know easier said than done.
I know from a Montana Foundation perspective, we are definitely looking to try to partner with the bigger guys to be able to have a wiser use and better use of our funds. And so the leverage aspects, and to partner with you if you've got some federal TAR or the ARRA money coming in and you need a match, we want to be able to try to help, but a lot of times that match may be higher than our average grant or the grant, and that's where we need to get some partnership from the bigger guys. But we're willing to try to move a little bit out of our box to make sure that you can take advantage of every bit of that federal money that might be coming down, and other nationwide foundations that will require matches or leveraging.
I would just say I agree with your perspective on that, Mike, and I view us, Northwest Area Foundation, as on the smaller side of that scale. We're in this middle place between a local foundation and somebody like Ford or Kellogg. One of the interesting things that came along within the last couple of months is that George Soros has established George Soros runs the Open Society Institute. You probably know who he is, but he established a big pot of money that is meant to alleviate poverty. He wants to get it into the hands of poor people as cleanly as he can. So we're trying to network with the person who's running that for him to say, well, if you want to get to rural communities, we could help you do that. So far it's just been like cocktail conversation. We haven't built the relationship successfully yet. So I don't mean to make it sound like relationship building is this easy thing. It's hard. But I think there is an opportunity there for a foundation like ours around rural, also around funding American Indian issues. I think there's a lot of ignorance and neglect in the mainstream big foundation community. And Kellogg clearly has been an exception to that, but they've had this change of leadership. But it's one of my goals to sort of keep at least knocking on the table saying, hey, the poorest places in this country, tend to be Indian reservations. The poorest people in our urban centers tend to be Native people. Where are you guys if you say you care about issues relating to poverty? Let us help you at least find opportunities and meet people. And there is a conversation brewing in Indian country about this very issue, how to engage the big funders in a more productive, ongoing way. We hope to be a part of that conversation at least.
Bonnie, want to comment on that?
I think one of the things that happened this past year that we can take a lot of pride in as a state is that the first Montana Funders Tour was organized. And I think it's a good example of Montana foundations that came together and invited some of the big guys to come and spend a week touring our state, getting to know our nonprofits, getting to know our issues. And I think that kind of long-term relationship building is going to pay off for Montana just as we've seen it pay off in Alaska. So I do want you to know, if you don't already, that the Montana foundations are working well together and really committed to these kind of investments and these relationships for the long haul. And there's lots more we can do.
Yeah, that's a good entree into an additional question we have on here. Are foundations working more together? I mean, we've got a great example of that in Montana with the Montana Funders Tour, the Montana Funders Group, but just generally speaking, your perceptions of sort of building on Mike's point about beginning to build some bridges that maybe weren't there in the past, but because of the economic situation has, I'll use the example when we did our survey about 3 or 4 months ago. I think many of you probably in the room completed this, that asked nonprofits about the impact of the economic recession on their organizations. And we learned what we thought we'd hear. Operating costs are up, demand for services are up, fund development is down. But we also asked a lot of questions about, well, how are you responding to that? And one of the things that came out of that survey loud and clear was 76% of organizations said that it is a direct strategy that they're going to use to collaborate more this year. That was a resounding voice from the nonprofit community about, I hear a lot about working together in collaborations in Montana. I think we do it better than most states, actually. But there's a commitment within the nonprofit community to push that envelope even more. So the general questions, is there more conversation within the foundation community about working more together, building partnerships, whether it's from regional, working with in-state foundations, regional foundations working with national foundations to find ways to bring more dollars into states like Montana?
I'll make a few comments. Definitely in Montana in our network of foundations, and when we're at things like a Philanthropy Northwest conference or Council on Foundations, we're advocates for the nonprofits in our states at that time and looking for like interests, so other funders that care about the same things that we do. And another opportunity out there is we are a state with many second home citizens and our individual donors, that opportunity to engage, and there's been some efforts out there to reach this population and let them know, we welcome them here and we're all neighbors, and we want to be, I'll use our tagline, neighbors helping neighbors, and there's opportunities to engage and help our nonprofits in the state also attract that type of donor as well as through the formal foundation sector.
I think there probably will be more conversations between foundations because when a foundation is making a grant, you're really wanting to make it on the basis that you believe the project will be successful, that the money will be raised indeed, and the project will be sustainable long term. So what that means sometimes is you're going to look at the proposal and talk with the organization and see who some of the other possible funders are, and may have some conversations with those folks about what they're thinking and where they're heading, and what the economic recession has done to their giving. So I think there are more conversations right now.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that Funders understand the importance of collaborating, but feel at times, I think, less of a sense of the wolf at the door than nonprofits feel. We're a little bit, we have a cozier situation in some ways than you all do on the front lines. It's just the truth. So it means we can be more hesitant if we want to. My sense of it is that for foundations, just like for nonprofits, good collaboration that's meaningful and impactful is going to happen when the collaborative partners see that the only way, or at least clearly the best way to get to the outcome they want, is to do it together. And what the calculation is, whatever I give up in control, I'm going to gain in effectiveness. And so for foundations, that means being less concerned about branding things with our name, which our foundation indulged in to the max in the past. We were all about things being a Northwest Area Foundation initiative. And, you know, if you can back off of some of that and partner with somebody who can double your resources for something, you have a much better chance of achieving what you're after in terms of your mission. So for us, I was explaining before our limited funding flexibility in the near term, so we can talk about partnering. What I've been unable to do yet is sort of bring the resources, really, but we've taken some small steps. So that Horizons program that I mentioned to you, there's an issue in that program, which is it's about an 18-month thing that occurs in community. And the question is, okay, what then? How do you build on the energy that's unleashed in a community in an 18-month process? Big question for us. The Annie E. Casey Foundation also cares passionately about rural places and has a program of their own called the Rural Family Economic Success Program, and we decided to do a couple of pilots with Casey where we would bring their, what they call Rufus program, to bear in places that had graduated from the Horizons program. So it's an experiment. We'll see. If it works really well, we'd be very happy to go into that partnership in a bigger way. Another partnership, quite unusual, that we've been involved in is that several of the biggest foundations in Minnesota came together to support a project to try to look at the state's budget crisis and come up with fresh ideas. This was very interesting because it was foundations saying, well, we can play in that arena. We might have something to contribute that isn't being contributed. What you had was Minnesota, like 7 of the 8 states that we serve, has this gaping budget hole, huge structural problem that is either going to be kicked down the road and patched with duct tape year after year, or at some point we're going to have to make some fundamental changes to how the state tries to deliver services to the people of Minnesota. You had everybody saying, we need new ideas. The legislative leaders, the governor, were all saying, we need new ideas, we need fresh ideas, but they were not coming. It was, the debate was locked in the old back and forth between no new taxes and you can't cut these programs or people will die. You know, it was very much locked in the old model. So I think it was 5 foundations threw a little money into a pot and hired some really smart consultants and worked with them then directly ourselves over about 6 weeks on the question of, well, if we really want new ideas, what would new ideas look like for how to do business differently in Minnesota so that the citizens get the same or better services for significantly less money in some specific areas. And we put forward this package of, I think it was about 9 different big ideas, none of which have gained any traction with the governor or the legislature. So far, it's certainly open to the interpretation that we were, you know, chasing our tails and that it was a collaboration for nothing. But the problem isn't going away, and the ideas actually are interesting. So our hope is that if we sort of keep the flame alive and find some nonprofit partners who see their own agenda in those ideas and can run with them, that some of that thinking that we invested in will eventually bubble up and shape some of the future solutions to that budget hole. So that has been a very interesting process, and it was purely collaborative. There was one foundation leader, Peter Hutchinson, who runs the Bush Foundation in St. Paul, who spearheaded it because of his own interests and expertise, but it was very much a collaborative thing and unusual in my experience.
This, by the way, is a very good primer for our plenary panel this afternoon, which will be focusing a little more on the issues of collaboration, both within the nonprofit community and foundation community. Bonnie, do you want to comment before I go to a couple questions out here?
Yeah, I was just going to add, the Charlotte Martin Foundation, we like to fund in rural and tribal communities, and we work with small organizations. We like to collaborate. We like to listen a lot to our fellow foundations. One of the things that we look for, especially in the area of wildlife and habitat preservation, is other foundations that have done studies that have really delineated what the critical wildlife issues are. In those areas, we pay a lot of attention to whether it's local studies or regional studies before we make those decisions, because there's so much changing in that area. On the flip side, we fund youth athletics, and there's very few foundations that have that as an emphasis. Charlotte Martin was a great athlete and wanted to encourage that in young people. And so we make those decisions largely on our own and fund really interesting things like swimming clocks and track renovations and things like that that might be out of the ordinary. So it's a mix for us every time, and we like to partner.
Well, Brian, just quickly, the only collaboration aspect that hasn't been mentioned is the critical one of maybe helping with the advocacy side of public policy, so that those public officials out there just don't cut those programs and assume that all of you will pick up the responsibility. And so the advocacy side, we're moving more and more with the Philanthropy Northwest and our regional grant makers, as well as our local funders, to try to deal with the education of public officials, particularly with term-limited legislators who don't understand that they are pushing all of those problems onto the nonprofit sector or out there on the street where they will be very visible. And so it's that advocacy role that I think we're going to, it's forcing collaboration on our part to try to help make sure that your jobs aren't made more difficult by all those cuts that they're going to make. So.
Okay. I'm going to come around here to Peggy. She's been wanting to ask a question for a bit. Peggy, I'm going to ask you to use the microphone. We've got our good friends from Missoula Community Access Television filming here, and I want to make sure we can capture the question.
Thanks, Brian. My name is Peggy Grimes, and I'm the Executive Director of the Montana Food Bank Network, and we are a statewide organization that provides food and other support to over 200 emergency food programs across the state. And I have a question that I want to hark back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier about foundations supporting new programs. When you look at an organization like ours, the economic downturn has been severe on the people that we serve. So it has precipitated the need for us to develop a couple of new programs that will help provide food for children in the schools, and also for individual families who have never entered a local food pantry before, but are finding themselves having to get some additional help. So my question in that regard is, for those foundations that really are kind of, circling the wagons, as it were, and supporting those organizations that they have supported in the past, that's great if we're one of them, but if we're not, and we really need to get into a new arena of new funding, is there, are foundations looking at that there are organizations who really do need to reach out and support some new programs, and it may be for a short period of time until the economy improves. So that's my first question. My second question is, as a nonprofit organization, we're always looking to diversify our funding base. So I'm interested to know if, as foundations and funders, are you looking at any social entrepreneurship opportunities? And if so, are you looking at any program-related investment dollars going towards that social entrepreneurship activity that might help fund that organization in perpetuity, for the long run? So those are my two questions.
Who wants to jump in on one or both? Dave?
Well, one, I would differentiate between new organizations and new programs for us. While we're much less likely to fund a new organization, new to us, we don't have any problem with looking at an organization we have funded and some kind of a new program. And yes, there is interest in programs that are going to creatively deal with some of the economic realities in our society.
I'll just jump in quickly to say that Northwest Area Foundation does have a program-related investment portfolio. Our current ceiling on that is $10 million, and it's pretty much fully invested. So until some of it rolls back in, we don't have a lot of flexibility there either. Our focus has been on capitalizing community development financial institutions, which is very much on mission for us. But the point that you raised is a good one. I mean, I think it's certainly worth thinking about how program-related investments can help. So the social entrepreneurship thing, by which I'm taking you to mean nonprofits that are generating an income stream as well, and doing so in a socially useful way. I mean, it's a wonderful model. I think it's a tough one. You know, it's another one of those things like collaboration and merger and so forth that's a lot harder than it sounds. It's a lot harder in practice than it sounds in theory, but really a promising avenue, I think.
We have not done, and I don't anticipate us doing any program-related investments anytime soon, but again, when we look at our sources of secured funding that someone puts on their preliminary application, if a Murdoch is on there, or First Interstate, or Charlotte Martin, that adds credibility to that application. We know that you've done your homework, and so it makes it easier for us and for the grants committee that looks at it first before it goes to the board to be able to say, you know, there's a credible organization, new program, let's give it a try. So we'll take a look at those. We're not hamstrung by any of the problems that maybe some of the other foundations are experiencing as far as old programs versus new programs. We'll go out and we'll try to fund a new program if it's measurable and it's got some performance-based aspects to it.
And, you know, we look at new programs, new organizations that we haven't funded before. We are just, you know, like a lot, focused on basic needs and want to make sure that, you know, these are relevant programs to the community needs, and the backpack program is a terrific one, and we had a great opportunity leveraging with our employees. We offered a double match to their employee giving if it was going to food programs, and I know the backpack programs were at the top of the list there.
We do look at new organizations, and we just recently funded an interesting social entrepreneur effort that's going on in Lewistown, Montana, where a organization is helping young people build houses, build structures, and then they're selling them to keep their organization going. And they've had a lot of success, and we felt good about making a grant that were going to enable them to scale that work up. So I think where there are social entrepreneur efforts that are well thought out, we are interested in them.
Maybe we could do a show of hands in the room. Who has been successful this year in securing grant funds for new programming or new projects? So, you know, maybe about a third of the room, a quarter of the room. It's certainly been challenging for us too, as well.
Can I just pick up on something that Kelly said real briefly, Brian? Her emphasis on leverage and leveraging resources is critical at a time like this. This is a somewhat obvious point, but when it comes to foundation dollars to fund what needs to be done in Montana, I do think we need to recognize there's not enough. There's not going to be enough. That's just the way it is, I think, and I don't mean to create the sense that if you ask in just the right way, suddenly there will be enough. These are really tough times, and so leveraging other resources is critical. And I wanted to mention, and the fact that you work in hunger relief jogged my memory on this. Our foundation just did a national poll with state-by-state breakdowns for our 8 states of people's attitudes towards the struggle to make ends meet in their community. What we found nationally and in Montana is that between 40 and 50% of the people we spoke to don't know where to go if they themselves are in trouble in this recession. And what they mean by that is they're not sure where the food pantry is. They don't know how they might access something like food stamps. And of course, the stigma attached to some public benefits is also a barrier. So, and the best talking point in this dimension, I think, is the Earned Income Tax Credit, the most powerful anti-poverty tool that's been deployed in this country in the last 20 years. But I believe that in every state across the 8 that we serve, there's a meaningful gap between the number of people who are eligible for the EITC and the number of people who actually access it. Those are opportunities for organizations like yourselves and for funders like us to get into that gap and figure out how do people draw down resources, publicly available resources that may be simply sitting there unclaimed. And I thought it was important to mention that and encourage you all within whatever sphere your organizations work in to do an analysis about, are there available resources that we just don't think of? I used to work in hunger relief, and we didn't think about, well, do the people who are receiving the food draw down all of the public benefits that they might be eligible for? And if not, how can we help in that way to get food resources flowing? I wish we had thought about that. We were a little too young and not knowledgeable enough to know that that was a sort of a mission-critical place for us to go.
That's why we're new programs.
Amen.
Let's move to the back of the room. Here we go.
You guys talk about getting in the inner circle, building a relationship. Can you give us some tangible things to do that? Because I've been told that time and time as I'm learning more about the grant process, but other than going through the application and calling and asking questions and doing those sorts of things to kind of build the relationship, and even to just get in front of you all by submitting that grant, what are some other tangible ways to build that relationship? You know, because obviously, you know, your focus is on your current people you're currently funding, but you know, I understand the idea of building the relationship, but other than going through the grant process, what else is out there to, other than sending you Starbucks or something? I don't know.
Well, some people I think are afraid to make the phone call. Because I think, having been on the other side of the desk, foundations can be kind of scary places, and you wonder what's going on behind those closed doors and how they work, how they function. And some people are afraid to even make the call. And for a larger foundation, or a foundation that has the capacity to do that, that's a place to begin. So, and to make a request is a place to begin. And to get turned down, that's fine. You know, that's not, we certainly wouldn't hold that against any organization if we said no. That would not prevent us from taking a look at the organization again in the future. So, and then there's the hallways. We're going to be in the hallways here. So,
You know, I'll just add from the Main Street view, and that you know, the accessibility right through the local branches, because they're the ones that are going to recommend things up to the foundation. You know, we try to be accessible. I'll admit, in years past, I was at a Council on Foundations conference, and you know, little guy there couldn't believe some of the barriers that were put up in years past, so somebody couldn't get directly to that funder. You know, screening the calls, things like that. But you know, it's a changing environment, and we want to be involved and build those relationships. So, I mean, we think of ourselves as part of the community on the grassroots level, and you know, want to be able to you know, engage at that level. So, you know, come on in.
I guess I enjoy being able to talk with people coming through town who happen to be at various meetings, and they call up and would like to have a cup of coffee at wherever we can meet. And you know, in many cases, I've had to say, you know, maybe we're not a good fit right now. But as we evolve in the foundation, as Dennis and Phyllis put more money of their own into the foundation, as the companies make more money, we're going to need to evolve into a broader range of issues. And there may be other ways for us to help, because we are a combination corporate family foundation. And so there are lots of examples over the 6 years I've been there where, in fact, a priest out of Deer Lodge just called me the other day about trying to get help for their cemetery. Well, we don't fund cemeteries through the foundation or those kinds of projects, but I said, you know something, if you have a big fundraiser and we can buy a table for a couple $1,000s, I'll get our corporation to buy a table, and then at least it'll help you a little bit there. You know, so meeting with you at least gives me the opportunity to kind of think through where you're at in your process, and maybe tell you down the line where you might be a good fit.
So how does that fit then with you guys being so online driven with the inquiries? I mean, where's that going through the process, as you guys want to go through the process, but also trying to have that personal touch?
You don't need to, you can just call up and say, I haven't never submitted an application, I want to meet with you, and so no online process. And then if I'm going to try to help you on a project that potentially is not a good fit for the foundation, it'll be the corporate side that I go to, and that's where it'll come from, and I don't have to worry about, you know, the foundation infrastructure.
I really appreciate the question, because it is true that foundations have limited staff, limited time to do the kind of face-to-face relationship building that we would all want. So you're asking a great question. It's not always easy or even possible to really build that relationship. We do get to be pretty opaque institutions sometimes, to our discredit, I think. I would just circle back to something I said earlier, which is the importance of the research you do on the front end to understand where the fit might be. Because when there is really a fit between what your organization is doing and what a foundation is trying to accomplish and the way it says it wants to accomplish it, then you're an opportunity for us. You're not just, you know, another person who wants some of our time, to be kind of crass about it. You're somebody we really ought to know. So if you choose your targets, so to speak, carefully, I think you have a much greater chance of successfully getting somebody's attention and beginning to build that relationship. If you skip that step, another old joke I've heard in the field is where the conversation goes sort of like this: give us a grant. And the foundation person says, why? And the grant seeker says, because we need money. And that's not the way to frame the conversation. It's got to be because we do what you say you want to accomplish. We do it really well. And if you can't fund us now, okay, but why don't you come and see what we do? Or let me sit down with you for an hour and tell you about it. And the cleaner of a fit you can actually find between what you do and what that funder says they're interested in, the more successful you'll be, instead of just spinning your wheels.
And sometimes some pre-proposal or pre-letter of inquiry conversation with the foundation can be very helpful. Because once you're in with the proposal, you're a bit locked in, and it's a little bit hard to change the proposal. So some conversation in advance can really be helpful. And you know, the worst thing is, I suppose, that a foundation won't return your phone call, or you know, they won't have time to get to you. But boy, you take the chance, make the call, try to initiate the relationship. Stop us in the hallway, do whatever you can to just work at it.
We move on this side of the room. We'll go in the back here.
I've heard a few of you talk about how you fund new programs, new initiatives, but I've also heard that you don't fund overhead, or I've heard we don't traditionally fund overhead, but we've made a few exceptions recently. I'm curious, in this climate, are any of you looking to be more progressive on that front, to start looking at funding overhead more and more, because overhead is what drives the programs?
Well, I'll try to take an attempt to answer that. When I said we don't fund operations, we don't fund ongoing overhead. But an organization that is buying some new trucks to move food, I guess that's overhead. Seems to me it's a program expansion. Yeah, an organization that's working at deciding they need a development director, you know, that can be construed as overhead, but that's capacity building. We're interested in looking at those proposals. Well, here's how we would look at overhead. If you're asking us for some money that's going to pay the rent for the building you're already in, we would assume you've already funded the rent. And the same is true if you're asking us money to fund a staff member who's already doing something, a communications director, for example. For us, that's overhead, that's operation. That doesn't build your capacity. We would be looking at something new, a communications director, a marketing director, a development director, a new program director, so that something that is expanding your work, even though it may not be very glamorous and it may be viewed as overhead. There's nothing wrong with that. If you don't pay for some overhead, you won't have any program. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. What I'm wondering is, you said that you don't do a lot of multi-year grants, but you do have organizations that you continue to fund on a renewal basis, I'm assuming. These are programs that you obviously support over a number of years. They have this existing overhead, and I know many
many organizations are losing funds that they used to use for the purposes of overhead, the non-new capacity, so what's already in place. And so I know more and more that organizations are looking to replace funds that they once had that are now diminished or lost totally. And I'm wondering, are any of you as funders looking to make that leap?
We don't fund anyone year after year after year after year. We may do a multi-year program grant or capacity building grant that declines over a 3-year period. But when the project is done, the project is done. So we just don't do any ongoing operations, and I don't think we ever will. I think in our discussions that if we put money into operations, even at this point in time where that would be very, very helpful, when an organization is ready to do some kind of a project, a capital project, and we've already spent our money on operations, where's the money going to come from for the capital project? That money is tough to raise too. So,
2 points I would make. One is that we are open to general operating support grants when providing that grant is the most strategic way for us to try to advance our mission. So if what an organization is doing in total is the best way we can think of spending X number of dollars to move an issue, we would consider doing that grant in that way. What we would try to avoid is simply becoming an assumed funding stream year after year for an organization, because that's not probably the best use of our limited resources. But we are, I mean, you use the expression making that leap. I wouldn't claim we're making that leap, but we have opened the window to that conversation. We will not say, nope, no general operating support, which I think we probably would have at some times in the past. The other point I want to make, and I'll do it briefly, is that I would urge you to get into the discussion with funders about building indirect costs into your project grant requests. You know, universities have no compunction about this, and those indirect cost rates are high. Nonprofits often do. I've seen many grant requests where they seem to have created a budget that indicates that, you know, either there is no overhead or indirect cost associated with this project, or, oh, that's all taken care of by somebody else. My view is, if I'm funding you for a specific project, I ought to be paying some portion of the freight on the larger organization that is carrying out that project. If that proportion is 10, 15, 20%, I'm still not going to die of sticker shock. There would be a limit to, but I would just urge you to push your funders on, well, we're putting a line item in the budget here called indirect costs or whatever, because we can't do that project that you're funding us for unless you help us with the rest of the picture. I mean, that's just a values statement from me. I think there are funders who don't agree with that view, but that's how I see it.
There are, and we would,
and here he is.
And we would comb through that budget to determine which items would be eligible in our funding and which items would be ineligible. And that would be ineligible, but we assume you can find that money somewhere else. We're not going to be the only funder of the project, so and generally our grants are a little bit larger, so there's usually a way.
Let me ask a question that builds on that a little bit and brings it more to the level of capacity building funding. And my sense is that, at least out here in the Northwest, Kit Gillum, program officer from Murdoch Charitable Trust, recently, I think, just finished his term as the chair of Philanthropy Northwest, the board. And Kit and Murdoch have been doing a lot of work in capacity building, both recently and, frankly, over time. He's brought that to Philanthropy Northwest, and there's been a lot, it seems that there's a lot more conversation, perhaps, in the Northwest about supporting, I don't want to get us sort of bogged down into sort of terms like, administration, overhead, because I bet you if we polled folks in the room, we would define those a little differently. But the general notion of funding for capacity building, is that finding a renewed sense of life within the foundation community? If so, what's driving that? And if not, why not?
It is getting more attention by our board, and because of what we learned at Philanthropy Northwest annual meeting, and because of what Murdoch has led in terms of trying to help nonprofits. It's not something we traditionally have funded, and we're going to, I think, be able to help in that area, but it's going to be small grants, and we do multi-year grants. We've got a dozen out of about 180 grants a year that we fund are 2 to 3 year grants, and we will we'll get into operations, but we like to the groups in the room that we actually give the annual grants to. It's such a tiny percentage of their budgets that you can't call it a major operational funding. It just kind of helps pay the bills, but I think capacity building is an area that we want to get into, but it will be in partnership with others who perhaps can do it at a higher level, and we can be a partner on certain pieces of it.
And I think the short answer to your question for us is yes. The thing for me is that I get nervous sometimes about the phrase capacity building, because if it slips into being jargon, it can be another way of saying general operating support, or to me it should mean a specific thing, which is that when that capacity building grant is over, the organization will be stronger and fitter for the long term, even if that's the end of the funding relationship. That to me is the high bar of real capacity building. And for us, building the capacity in some way like that of organizations that are already in place in communities doing work that's on mission for us, which is reducing poverty, building prosperity among low-income communities, a grant like that would be very attractive to us.
We fund such a large array of projects that it's hard to find the best way to do capacity building, and one of our best ways at First Interstate is to support things like this, so the nonprofit association. And then we look to our other resource that we have, and that's the employees of First Interstate. There we worked with Brian's team and are developing an in-house web training for our employees that matches our company's culture and values with the nonprofit board role. So how do you become a responsible nonprofit board leader? How do you serve on the board? How do you find what matches your passion to theirs? So we're looking at things like that. We've got facilities, we've got video conferencing. So, any ways that we can partner with others to build capacity with the resources that we have that are not always cash, we're very open to that discussion and looking for new ways to do that.
And I would just add at Charlotte Martin, we are limited by our trust document in terms of what we fund. She was fairly clear on what she wanted those resources to go for. However, we are very open in those program areas to existing programs that are working, providing support to continue them, and paying portions of salaries related to that. We don't pay indirect cost, but we certainly will fund salaries related to programs, and are open to a lot of collaborative work where we can advance larger initiatives by contributing a smaller grant that builds something larger as a whole.
I want to come back here to Heidi. She had a question she was going to follow up on.
Well, I'm Heidi Arneson with Junior Achievement, and one of the things about us for capacity building, and I see with other organizations, is to get to the low-income communities, to get to the at-risk students, to get to the rural areas. We need intermediate steps, because when we look at ourselves long-term, it's not efficient for me to go to a community of 5,000 and out for programs. It'd cost $2,000 to $3,000 per group of students. But if I can develop a nearby hub in a larger community, I can now serve those rural areas for $500 per group of students. So I know for us, having funding helping with those intermediate steps is what will help us be able to get to those rural areas, where if you funded me directly for rural areas, that'd be great, but that wouldn't be an efficient use of your resources or my resources. So looking at long-term planning, helping us with those refrigerated trucks, with building hubs or whatever, to help us get to that goal. In communities, we do what the community asks for. They may ask us to target low-income youth. They may ask us to target at-risk youth. They may say, we want you to hit all middle school kids because we know you're going to hit a lot of our low-income or at-risk youth that way. We let the community define. So it also gives a challenge for us to say, well, we could look for funding if you said only do this. We try and reach the students that the community wants. So there's kind of a juggling act there, and how do we work with your foundations to make that happen? Thank you.
I will try to answer that and then say something about the capacity building, because that, in a sense, in part is capacity building. We do larger grants, so that sort of narrows down the kinds of things we would fund. But if you were to say to us, we would like to open a new office in western Montana or central Montana and put a person there to build a hub that will serve rural communities, then that program expansion, yes, is capacity building. It's program expansion, and we would be interested in that. We've also funded first-time executive directors, first-time development directors, first-time communication and marketing directors. And when we fund those positions, we will generally fund at 100% the first year of the salary, of the compensation costs, and usually some startup costs related to the position. 67% the second year, 33% the third year, with some contingencies built in, so you have to be raising some money along the way so that when we are gone, there's an exit strategy and the program is sustainable long term. So that's the kind of capacity building we do, and a program expansion or opening a new office can be part of that capacity building. I would say some other capacity building examples would be a software system. We've done that for a number of theaters, of ticketing systems, because we have purchased food bank trucks, but not your trucks, I don't think. But and sometimes a building or a renovation or expansion. Sometimes that's going to help an organization build its capacity. So there are a lot of ways to build capacity that go well beyond just simply putting money into operations.
We've got time for one or two more questions, and then we'll go with a closing question for the panel. Let's go one up here, and then we'll come in the back.
I'm wondering if you would comment on evidence-based giving and measurable outcomes. I'm Shirley Folkwine, Director of Yellowstone CASA in Billings, and working in human services sorts of programs with children and looking at long-term outcomes. We don't get funded to do longitudinal studies.
This is the segment of our panel that's called Stump the Panel. Does anyone want to take a...
I would definitely address that. I think as living both in the realm of being a nonprofit executive director and then reviewing proposals that have evaluation plans in them and trying to figure this out, I think we live in an age as in nonprofits that we can't afford not to have some type of longitudinal evaluation work going on at our organization at some level, and figuring out how you're going to capture that data, doing it consistently, because we need to know as organizations what's working. And we need to be able to articulate that and share that. We can't get funded in the future without this information, because I know, at least when I have my reviewer hat on and looking at dozens and dozens of education program proposals that are all online and doing background research, the ones that often rise to the top are the ones that can show they have measurable, deliverable results. And it matters a lot. And so I would encourage you to go back to your boards and back to your staff and ask those questions. What can you do? Who can you partner with? This is where I think the universities in our state can be a huge help. One of the wonderful things about Montana is we have a lot of tribal colleges with graduate students and students that are willing to help with studies. And we have access to professors that know good program research design. And this doesn't have to be that complicated. I think it's that continuing commitment to collecting some kind of information that allows our organizations to make better decisions and to find ways we could communicate that. So I do want to say I think this is a good conversation for future meetings, and to talk about how you can collect that data without it being a burden.
We've just got a couple minutes. Just have a couple minutes left here. So maybe just a final question for the panel, and this is maybe not an easy one, but could be short and brief. Any final words of wisdom, sage advice? What should nonprofits be doing or plan to do differently, or do more of the same as a result of changes in foundation funding? going forward.
Maybe I'll just start. I think that the brief statement is kind of the focus of what we just did at Philanthropy Northwest, and that's convincing the federal government, the state government, and local governments in some meaningful way that we are critical partners in this process, and that nobody's an adversary, everybody's in this together. And we've all heard those words, but how do we change that into some tangible programs so that you end up with some measurable impacts? As you look at poverty in 1933, poverty is about the same as it was back then. And you look at some of the other issues with respect to youth. And so I guess the point would be we've got to all do everything better, and instead of just talking about collaboration, we've got to work to do it. And so it's whether it's federal and state and local officials, helping them understand their appropriate roles in the process so that then we can understand our appropriate piece of that action, and nonprofits can then understand theirs. I think we want to help with that, and we want to be able to, my job is to spend Dennis's money, and I don't have any problem doing that. I mean, I want to do that, okay? And I'm a cost center at the company, and they know that. And so I think it's important for me to be able to do that within that donor intent in that eligibility criteria.
I'm actually not big on dispensing allegedly sage advice, but since Brian asked, I will try. In a period of scarcity, which we're in right now, clearly, my advice would be focus on what you do the very best. And instead of trying to do everything that you see is needed and that your organization might be able to tackle, you might need to just focus on what can we be the very best at doing. That, I think, makes you more attractive to potential funders and might make you higher performing for your community. But that represents a lot of tough choices and saying no to things that you know are needed. So you're welcome to completely discard that advice if you don't like it.
Well, I think what I would say, if you were bringing a proposal to us and we would come out and do a site visit and then evaluate that and do our analysis for our trustees, the first question would be, is this project you're working on truly your top priority? And is the timing right? You know, we're going to look at that really hard. And then we're going to raise the question, has the planning for this project been really good? I did a site visit to an organization the other day. After reviewing their proposal, I went to the meeting thinking they've got to have answers to these questions, and they didn't. And I thought, where has the planning been? So make sure you've done a really good job of planning if you have a project you're putting forward, and then have a plan to raise the funds and have a plan to sustain the project long term. So good work on the front end is very, very important to us, and I think very, very important to you as you think about new projects in the midst of a time when there may not be a lot of new projects being initiated.
Great. You know, really, a lot of what you're already doing, the networking and collaborating, you know, the relevance of your program, doing what you do best, as my colleagues have mentioned, you know, communicate with us. Several of us funding organizations were together yesterday, and we were just going on about how we love site visits and going to see you doing your work, to see the outcomes of the programs we're looking at investing in or are investing in, and that, because we need to be able to tell your story to be able to keep our funds flowing and to help communicate to other potential donors out there. So we want to work for you in that sense as well.
I don't know that I have sage advice for this group. This is a very smart room. But I would just encourage you to continue on working with like organizations, like your own, and partnering and putting together the strongest proposals that you can. I would also say, too, this is a time, or at least for Charlotte Martin, where if we have to say no, it's just no for now because the funds are limited. It's not no for next year or the year after. So please stick with us. We feel very badly we can't fund all the good proposals that are coming in, and we like so many of these organizations and want to continue building those relationships into the future. And I also want to thank you for the work that you do. I know this isn't an easy time now, and to continue to fortify your local resources, your friends, your neighbors, your boards, to keep those relationships intact, because the stock market will come back. We will be hopefully around in perpetuity to continue to build those relationships and contribute on some small scale that we can to your work.
And I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists and foundation leaders. It says a lot about your foundations being here and engaging in maybe a different kind of foundation panel than maybe you've used to. Really appreciate it. I want to thank all of you as well for your good questions. I'll mention that you'll notice on your agenda at the end of the day today we'll have a plenary foundation panel. Some of the foundation leaders are on the panel today. We'll be on panel later in the afternoon, and a few others. We'll be exploring some deeper questions about collaboration and in connections, and we hope to have that structure the same sort of way we have this here, where we can get some good questions and dialogue going from the audience. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you. I know you're hungry. Lunch is in the